as you were describing that there were numerous things being done under the aegis of research that posed ethical challenges, and that you were certainly aware of them because of your position in the government. And yet, when Tuskegee is exposed, do you have a recollection of what your thoughts are as you were first handed the stack of papers and going back to the 1930s and
Well, a lot of good research was being done at the time, and I thought, this has been going on for more than 30 years. It must be good research. So I started with the expectation of reading research that could not only be defended but praised. But I found nothing defensible about it. And so I had to write that short memo saying it's indefensible, and called to Richardson's office. He said, then write me testimony and tell me what we should do to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so I wrote 8 pages of testimony for him, calling for increased effort to exercise surveillance over the research that was funded by NIH and indirectly by all the research being conducted at that time almost exclusively by our universities. Mm-hmm. The drug firms were contracting out to the universities, so they did very little research of their own. The university was the center of research, and we began then to try to find ways to regulate research conducted within the university system of the U.S.
Did Tuskegee represent for the government, or particularly for Senator Kennedy and Rogers, was that the tipping point that gave them the last bit of momentum they needed to?
Yes, I think so.
Generate reforms?
As I indicated, they had conducted 4 years of hearings, so the public had already been alerted to the fact that there were lots of abuses. But the Tuskegee study, because it involved the abuse of 400 black males and their families, of course, and coming right at the end of the civil rights movement, when we had just passed laws in which we affirmed the dignity of all Americans, including African-American men, and then to see this scandal, which had been brewing for more than 30 years, it created an uproar. And of course, both Rogers and Kennedy, Rogers in the House, Kennedy in the Senate, and some other congressmen and senators immediately conducted hearings. And by the way, an aside, the lawyer who defended the lady who refused to get off the bus in Birmingham also defended the persons who were in the Tuskegee study. So he and I became fast friends. And
he ended up speaking at Primer several years ago.
Yes, he did, and he was a fine man, but he also defended Rosa Parks.
That's right.
And he considered that his greatest achievement. I look on Tuskegee as equally great, but anyway, he was a fine man, upstanding, and he was on television often and gained respect of the American people, who were open at the end of the civil rights debate to hearing from black lawyers who were well-educated, very smart, and able to describe the abuses that had been inflicted on their people. So it was a very rich time in to be in the government, to be working in the government. I often then was, because I had attended all those hearings, I was often called upon to write speeches for Senator Kennedy, for Congressman Rogers, and sometimes for other congressmen. So it gave me a chance to bring in much of my academic background to talk about the development of the civil rights movement and the importance of correcting abuses in the research system that were abusive of minorities. We also had cases involving Hispanics, we had cases involving Asians, and so if they were not as sensational, they were simply supportive of the fact that Tuskegee was not an isolated incident. There were lots more, and that moved the Congress to pass Public Law 93-348. The first part of that bill dealt with research training, but the second part dealt with, one, the requirement for the HHS, at that time HEW, the Health, Education, and Welfare, to issue regulations. And it also recommended that steps be taken to create surveillance of the research. And so I wrote into the regulations. It was odd that Senator Javits, Senator Kennedy, and Paul Rogers' staff all turned to me to draft Title II of that bill, which dealt with the National Commission and with new regulations. And a funny thing happened. Senator Kennedy said, "I will bring the bill to the floor on condition that HEW publishes regulations for the protection of human subjects." The department was so anxious to get this off the front pages because it was a black eye when it was repeated over and over again. So I was put on a committee of 3 to draft the regulations in 1974.
Mm-hmm.
And the two persons on the committee with me had personal grudges and wouldn't speak to each other. And it was the strangest committee I've ever worked on, where Jane Fullerton on my right would say, "Would you please tell the doctor on your left that I think this passage needs to be changed?" It was like a sitcom, except it was real life. But despite those difficulties, we produced a set of regulations. Senator Kennedy found them acceptable. The department skipped all the clearance processes and published the regulations. And so Public Law 93-348 was enacted into law on July 3rd, 1974. And among other things, it created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. And so I had written the charter for the National Commission and was happy to see that that part of the legislation went through without alteration. And so, among other things, it called for the principles that should govern medical research and created the National Commission. So that was the forerunner, or maybe the seedbed of the ethics report that was issued by the Commission, including the code that required respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So that part of the regulation was really, in a sense, the seed of it was sown by my own efforts. And maybe if I do nothing else in life, that was important to do.
This is obviously a really exciting time for research ethics, and you have a passion about that. I'm curious if among your immediate colleagues, if there was a shared passion for this, or if this was really for you a special project, or was this a because of the events of the day and the political interest in it, was the enthusiasm widespread within the institute?
It certainly was not. At the time, it was customary for medical ethicists to criticize research after the results had been published. It was very unusual, almost without exception. Ethicists were never consulted when the research was designed. Then when it was carried out, ethicists had a field day in saying the scientists did it all wrong. And so the scientists at NIH were very resentful of the field of ethics. They felt that they were kind of like carrion crows feeding on the products of their work. And everywhere I went at NIH, and remember there were about 14,000 scientists at NIH, I didn't find a one who had any respect for biomedical ethics. So in that process, I again talked to the people in the Kennedy Institute, which was just forming, and talked to them about the problem in my perception that ethicists had lost their clout precisely because they were not involved in planning research. When it was done, they had lots of criticism, and nobody likes to get criticism after they've completed important research. So I began to work with Dr. Leroy Walters over at the Kennedy Institute, and we planned a series of seminars on biomedical ethics. We had one every month, and I was able, or he was able, to persuade ethicists from all over the country to come free of charge to talk about biomedical ethics and the things that scientists should think about when they are designing their research. The first seminar was a disaster. Dr. Walters, myself, and one other person, Charles McKay, showed up for the seminar, and we were the people who had designed it. So we thought this may not work. But the second one had 6 or 7 people, and within a year or two we were commending 400 to 500 scientists coming, many of them to argue. And so we changed the format a little bit, and we have an ethicist opposite a scientist. And the scientist would present some ideas about important research to be done, and the ethicist would say, that's a noble goal. Now, here's how you can do it without violating the rights of the subjects. And that quickly caught on. And so in a course of roughly by 1980, the whole tenor of NIH had changed from hostility to ethicists to endorsement. And all of a sudden, universities began to provide people with training in ethics, and they made themselves available to scientists. And so the quality of the research was changed dramatically. And I cannot give enough credit to Dr. Walters for first the idea of those seminars, then recruiting his colleagues to come and participate. And he was so engaging and so clever and so funny that he was extraordinarily popular. Even though they didn't want to agree with him, he won them over. And changed the whole atmosphere of 14,000 scientists at NIH, and many of them stayed at NIH only a year or two and then went to other research centers, and consequently, the radiation from that seminar series was dramatic. In the meantime, we began to look at the regulations we had drafted in such a hurry, and we found many shortcomings in them. So we began the process of redrafting. One of the things in Public Law 93-348 was a requirement to create a national commission for the protection of human subjects of biomedical and behavioral research. And that was a significant step because the behavioral and social science community felt we are not invading anybody's body. We don't need to be regulated. There are no risks involved. And so I was called to Senator Kennedy's office one day. I didn't know why they summoned me there, but they took me in a hearing room. There were 17 university presidents in that room, all invited by Senator Kennedy. And the senator simply said, "Would you explain to these gentlemen why behavioral and social science is included in your proposed regulations for the protection of human subjects?" And I was kind of dumbfounded. I was unprepared. I had no notes. But it occurred to me that I could talk about, I knew the details about some research that was conducted in the Midwest that was sometimes called the tea room trade. Mm-hmm. That was a kind of acronym that had been developed for research that was carried out to find out what the lives of homosexuals were like. And so the investigator in that case camped out near a washroom in the downtown area of his city. I think it was Toledo, but you may correct me on that.
You might be right, yeah.
In any case, he would then follow people who had engaged in homosexual activity, get their license numbers, then he would dress up and go to their offices or homes, interview them, and he published the details of their lives. At that time, there was such a bias against homosexuals and homosexual activity that when he published details of their lives, he gave enough clues so that people could identify them. And literally hundreds of gay persons lost their jobs, had their families blown up. And so I presented that case to the university presidents and said, that's why behavioral and social science research needs to be regulated. That was a dreadful invasion of the rights of those people who never consented to be in the research. And the result was destructive of many families and the careers of many men. And after that, there was silence from the university professors, and there was no more opposition to our including both biomedical and behavioral and social science research in the regulations. And so I considered that to be manna from heaven in the sense that I was unprepared and I just thought of that at the last minute, and it proved to be an effective argument.
If I could go back for a minute, you were speaking before about the impact that Leroy Walters had on
Yes.
the environment and the attitudes towards ethics at the time, but I don't think I know how you first came to know him. And if maybe you could tell me a little bit about that.
Well, when I was at Catholic University in the middle of the controversy over the firing of an ethics professor, he was a priest who taught ethics and was very popular, but he decided to apply to be released of his priestly vows and come back as a layperson. The university fired him, and consequently, because he was very popular, the students went on strike, and the American Association of University Professors said his changing his religious status has nothing to do with his classroom performance, and therefore it is illegal for you to fire a tenured professor simply because he's coming as a lay person rather than a priest. The whole university was divided over the question. The faculty mostly wanted to defend him, and the students fiercely wanted to defend him. And the students figured out that if they notified all the donors to the university that this was an injustice, that it might carry some weight, and indeed it did. The university collapsed. They gave this priest 2 years' salary and found a place for him at Marquette University, where he's still teaching, by the way, although I think I saw that he's retiring this year. He must be like me, well over age. And his wife has since died, but he was a popular teacher at Catholic U and later at Marquette. But that whole episode indicated to me how important it is to distinguish one's private life from one's professional life. And he did nothing wrong, and yet he was fired, and it took the whole university community to stand up to defend him. So that was part of the background that led to some of this. Mm-hmm. Some of what I was doing was because in those days we had close relationships with the Congress. I wrote a lot of speeches, and the congressman delivered them, many of them on the floor, and those speeches were indicative of, they were teaching devices for the Congress to become more sensitive to ethics. A lot of what I prepared for the congressman was reviewed and inspired by Dr. Leroy Walters, who had been brought into the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. I do not know how I could have succeeded in my job through those years without advice almost weekly from Dr. Leroy Walters. He was, I think at the time, and in my judgment, still may be the best ethicist in America, and a good friend.
So did you seek him out at that time, or?
I did. I met him because Father Charles Curran, who had also been in trouble with the Vatican for some of his teaching, particularly on contraception. Father Curran turned to social ethics as opposed to medical ethics so that he would not run contrary to the bishops. When I talked to him, he said, "I'm getting out of that field. The person you should be dealing with is Dr. Leroy Walters." So that's how I came in touch with him. And we actually met at an ethics movie that was conducted by Senator Kennedy about a family that allowed a Down syndrome child to starve because they did not want to take care of their child. And so we got, that happened at Johns Hopkins University, and we got involved in that case, even though it was technically outside the limits of my job. So those were all kind of things in the air at the time, and I think I probably would not have been allowed to do many of those things except for the breadth of vision of Tom Kennedy, my immediate boss, who said, you should be involved in anything you want to be involved in as long as you're able to get your basic work done. And I was involved all over NIH, all over the city, all over the Congress. It was a busy time for me. It was very fulfilling because most of the things we tried to do, we accomplished in some form or other. And then it fell to me once Public Law 93-348 was enacted. It fell to me to organize the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. And I learned another whole dimension of government, how you procure furniture, desks, telephones, meeting places, and all the rest. And I actually worked for 3 months for the commission as staff to get them started. And then once launched, I withdrew because I felt I was too close to having stated their mission. I thought I had to stand aside. But I followed them, and the secretary, who was, I think it was then Joe Califano, Secretary Califano, appointed me as liaison to the commission. So I attended every one of their meetings. And then Dr. Fredrickson, who had started out opposed to ethics, but we had turned him around with the strategy I talked about earlier, Dr. Fredrickson appointed me as his own advisory committee director. So I was working with the National Commission and with the advisory commission to the director, NIH, and I could translate ethical principles and discussions from the National Commission to the director's office and get university presidents and chancellors and other dignitaries to advise Dr. Fredrickson to follow ethical guidelines. And so we transformed NIH, we enabled the commission, and I was privileged to follow all their work. And then because I had contacts on the Hill, I was able to write speeches so that got translated to the floor of particularly the House, but some in the Senate. And so we were now moving toward better medical ethics on at least 3 or fronts simultaneously. Those were busy days for me.
I'm curious not about procuring telephones and tables and chairs for the National Commission, but what are your recollections for how the actual members of the commission were identified and selected, and what are your memories of their first times getting together?
Oddly enough, the selection of the members, I thought sure because of many other involvements with the National Commission that I would be at least consulted about selecting members. Nobody was consulted. This new secretary was Cap Weinberger, who was later known as the head of the Department of Defense. He was not well known in his 2 or 2.5 year tenure as secretary of HEW. And I think it was during his time it became HHS. But in any case, he selected those members, and no one knows where he got the names or how he made the selection. But as it turned out, it turned out to be a very wise, industrious commission. I have heard it said by a number of historians that they were the best advisory commission ever convened by the government. I don't know how one measures that. I don't know if it's true, but I certainly believe that they were very good and very conscientious. And they not only had good persons on the commission, but they hired top flight people to advise them. So there were a number of people like Tom Beecham, the great author. Particularly at that time, he and his wife published a book on informed consent. They had Dr. Bob Levine, and they had a scholar whose name I'm blocking on now from the University of Chicago, who was a great sociologist. So they had, and Barbara Mishkin, who had worked with me in a number of projects. She worked for the Child Health and Human Development Institute, and who had very clear ideas about abortion, about what could or could not be done. She was a lawyer who eventually resolved a case where a woman was dying of cancer, and whether her body could be kept alive long enough for the child to be viable, and actually a live child was born to a dead woman. And she was involved in that case. And of course, NIH was watching that case very carefully. So we had lots of exciting issues at the time. The commission was beginning to develop its work. And one by one, the commissioners were talking to Dr. Walters, who was not a member of the commission. But they also discovered how fertile his mind was, how clear his thinking was. So he had an enormous effect on the commission. And he later published, well, I think I mentioned that I was secretary or executive secretary of the Directors Advisory Commission and the Secretary's Ethics Commission.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was able to give a contract to Dr. Walters, who wrote a 1,200 page paper on human in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer, which is even today still controversial.
Sure.
It is remarkable how he addressed not only the ethical but the legal issues associated with human in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer. He also addressed the ethical aspects of taking tissue from aborted fetuses and using that tissue in research. So he had an enormous influence. Then when the DNA controversy came along, Fredrickson had him in his office on a daily basis. Dr. Fredrickson, the director, had him in his office on a daily basis, advising him about what we could do in order to educate the public about how risky, and it wasn't very risky, but many people were claiming it was risky. Dr. Walters directed much of that effort. So as a federal advisor, I know of no one who had such profound influence on so many different issues, and such a good friend. I don't think through my public career more than a week or two ever passed without my conversing with him about something. And I felt as if here is a person who ought to be paid by the federal government. Most of the government had no idea that he was shaping policies, but he's one of the unsung heroes. And one of the things he was interested in doing, and in fact I think planted the seed in my mind, to create a national commission. And so that commission, of course, was the fulfillment of my dream that was written into Public Law 93-348, that there be an education program associated with the regulations. That education program never developed as I had hoped it would. From the beginning, the government underfunded it. And of course, in the late 70s, there was a dip in federal funding. It was a recession, not as severe as the one we've just been through, but it was a recession, and the first place to be cut was the commission. And so it became clear to me that we were never going to have the quality of advice about the ethics of research that I felt it needed. And it was about that time, I think it was 1977 or maybe 78, that Dr. Chalkley, who was the head of the Office for Protection from Research Risks, had a stroke. And after 3 or 4 weeks, it became evident his recovery was never going to be complete. He resigned for medical reasons, and I was chosen to replace him. And one of the things he did before he had his stroke was agree to speak to a small group in Boston called Primer. Or I used to call it Prim and R. And Joan Racklin said that's not right, but I don't know what is right, except that we've argued for 20 years over it. It should be Primer or Prim and R. In any case, I was selected to give the talk that Dr. Chalkley had agreed to give and then was unable to give because of his illness. And when I gave that talk, it suddenly clicked in my mind that this small organization, I don't think there were more than somewhere between 50 and 100 people at that early meeting, but it occurred to me that this could be the advisory committee that I wanted established permanently to go with regulations. And so this next year, I was invited back to Primer, and it was at that time that we began to form a close alliance between the research conducted by the federal government and this outside body that was reviewing much of that research, offering ethical observations. And Primer has grown from, I think, 22 members in the early 70s to something like 3,500 members in today's world.
Closer to 4,000.
4,000.
Yeah.
And I know you, David, have had a lot to do with that. But and of course, at first its membership arm was called Arena, and then Arena was folded into Primer, but it has been a tower of strength and probably does a better job of critiquing the research conducted by the federal government, much of which is conducted by NIH. It does a better job, perhaps, than an internal advisory committee could ever have done. So, although I had this idea of an advisory committee, I never dreamed that Primer would emerge and flower and become the power that it is, and it can command speeches, documents, positions from virtually all the scholars in America. And Joan Racklin and her staff have done a magnificent job, first of building a board that feeds information to her office, and then she in turn has the prestige to build a large committee and to attract the very best speakers in the country. And I think Primer has become a force for good. I think it is a hedge against misuse of research dollars by the federal government. And of course, Primer largely through the careful selection of members on its board, has had a powerful interest on the drug industry in this country, which in turn radiates to the drug firms all over the country, particularly in France and England, all over the world, in France and England and other places. Primer is now establishing principles of sound ethics in countries all over the world. And because NIH funds research in some 80 nations, and its regulations follow the money, if a country anywhere accepts US dollars for research, it must accept US policy. That isn't always a one-to-one transfer, because some adjustments need to be made for cultural reasons, as you know better than I, because you've been involved in so much of that. But it is Primer that is behind promoting sound ethics behavior in at least 80 nations worldwide, and that influence is growing every year. I think I heard Joan Racklin say that we had 109 persons from outside the United States at our most recent meeting. I remember if we got one person, usually one from Canada and maybe one from England, we thought we had made a major coup. Now we take it for granted that all the continents will be represented at our meetings, and I expect that procedure to only increase and our membership to become worldwide. And so it's hard for me to, I hate to be an old man, because I'd like to come back and see Primer in 20 years or 30 years and see it as a world power that is promoting sound ethics in every country in the world. That's my hope, that's my dream, and I think it's within reach.